Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I know there are still some people who are coming in and registering, so hopefully that won't be too disruptive. But my name is Sarah Lowell, and on behalf of Indivisible OC48, I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for coming tonight. I think Michael Kotick is taller than I am, so I have to go on my tippy toes. So this is the third installment of the California 48th Congressional District Debate Series. And tonight we are going to be hearing from our candidates and their positions on the environment and climate. For so many politicians and candidates, the environment is a bottom-tier issue. For some, it doesn't even register on their radar. And for others, they actively are working against it. And for that, it is a badge of honor for them. But we need to elevate this issue to the level that reflects its true importance. And so we have devoted a full debate to environment and climate. That's been really, really important to us. So this issue touches on every single topic that has been covered in this debate series so far, and that we will be covering in the last debate. The environment is a women's issue when mothers have to weigh the risk of breastfeeding their babies because of concerns that they're dumping a lifetime of toxins into their newborns in their breast milk. The environment is an immigration issue when more and more people have to leave their homelands due to extreme drought, famine, flood, or other climate change impacts. The environment is a foreign policy issue when countries or regions become destabilized due to resource wars. It is a healthcare issue when diseases such as Zika and West Nile virus are now present in the United States. And it is a social justice issue when underserved communities, and predominantly communities of color, are on the front lines and receive the brunt of the impacts from toxins from industries like oil and gas. I could go on to talk about the economy, national security, and many other priority issues. That is why it is so critical for us to hear from the candidates tonight. Before I introduce our opening speakers, can I get a show of hands of how many of you have actively participated in any voter registration activities in this election cycle? Excellent. Well, bravo to all of you. That's fantastic. So we all need to be actively working to register more voters and get them out to vote on June 5th and then in November. There are weekly actions for people of all capabilities and talents to join in. So just go to swingleftsocal.org. You can see it's on the back of your program. So take that with you if you need a reminder, and sign up. So, and before I introduce our speakers, I have one last announcement. For those of you who live in Huntington Beach, you all know about the city council meeting from last night and the outcome where the city is now going to be suing the state of California. There is a city council meeting in Aliso Viejo. We need bodies, we need people to show up and show that there is support in this state for sanctuary. And so if you are available, tomorrow, April 4th, 7 p.m. In Aliso Viejo, and the address is 12 Journey. So we hope that you will show up because the other side is angry and ugly. So tomorrow, April 4th, 7 p.m. in Aliso Viejo. And so it is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers who are going to be opening it up and helping to ground this topic for us. So Wyatt Balladares is a youth leader from the Yahashman Nation and son of the current tribal chairman. He has advocated on behalf of the Yahashman Nation before the Coastal Commission, the California State Assembly, and the United Nations. And then following him will be Arliss Reynolds. She is an organizer and advocator for open space and environmental protection. In her day job, she studies strategies to green the energy grid. And in her free time, she serves as vice chair of the Parks and Recreation Commission in Costa Mesa and promotes environmental stewardship with the Orange County Earth Stewards. If you live in Costa Mesa, you'd be interested to know that Arliss is also running for city council. So with that, one last thing I want to do is to thank our co-sponsors. So Indivisible is has been organizing the series, but we couldn't do it without our co-sponsors and our volunteers. And so today's co-sponsors are California League of Conservation Voters, National League of Conservation Voters, Ocean Champions, and Orange County Environmental Justice. So thank you all. And so with that, Wyatt, please.
Miu, hello, welcome. This is the shared traditional lands of the Yahashman and Tongva Nation. It is with great honor that I stand before you tonight to acknowledge our homelands and Mother Earth. It is with great pride that I can say my ancestors traveled and lived off of this land and cared for the future generations. The continued stewardship of Mother Earth is not just important to us indigenous peoples, but to everyone around the world. Therefore, I come here tonight with a good heart, a heart that yearns for the proper care of Mother Earth, because the future generations need her just as much as we do. Noshun Lo'ovik, my heart is good.
Right, good evening, District 48. I want to first start by everyone just giving themselves a pat on the back for being here on a Tuesday night in Orange County. Congressional candidate debate. As one of my friends says, this is not your grandmother's Orange County anymore. So I thought we'd start with a little bit of audience warm-up. Instead of raising hands, though, because I think we have online viewers who can't see you, I'm going to ask you to clap your hands 3 times in response to a few questions. So if you understand me, clap your hands. All right, good. We'll start easy. If you believe in science, clap your hands. Good start. If you believe that human activity drives climate change, clap your hands. If you're even just a little bit scared about how climate change is going to impact our planet, clap your hands. Clap your hands if you drive an electric vehicle. Not bad. Clap your hands if you refuse to use plastic straws. We have a good audience here. Okay. Clap your hands if you're an active member of one of our local environmental organizations. All right. Clap your hands if you consciously, every day, try to reduce your impact on our environment. All of you can do better, I know. But I wanted to make the point that it's really easy in Orange County, especially coastal Orange County. It's really easy to say we care about the environment, but to forget about how urgent this crisis is. We're proud of our governor for standing up and signing the Paris Agreement. We're proud of setting the standard for fuel efficiency. Yeah, and holding to it, hopefully. We are proud of pushing towards 100% renewable energy. But we can't mitigate our climate crisis through 10-year and 20-year and 30-year plans. We need to start talking about how critical this issue is today and how it's affecting our lives today. And I hope we talk a lot about that tonight, and also how environmental impacts disproportionately affect certain communities, our low-income communities, our women, people of color. I hope we talk about how environmental impacts disproportionately affect our most vulnerable humans, including our children, who will feel the effects of our action or inaction long after we're gone. Oops. I was told not to be so doom and gloom. So, but we also need to talk about how every day that we don't act aggressively, the challenge becomes harder for us. And there are solutions. I'm not going to give any away. And I hope we hear from our candidates tonight about the solutions. I hope we hear their understanding of the urgency of this climate crisis. I hope we hear from our candidates an understanding of the injustice that exists in how we treat our environment today. I hope we hear from our candidates a commitment to prioritize environmental action in their first year in Congress. And I hope we hear from them how they expect to change the minds of so many of our policymakers who refuse to even acknowledge climate science. And I hope we hear how they plan to stand up to the powerful lobbies that are aggressively rolling back even our longest standing environmental regulations. So to ask those hard questions, we have a great moderator. Where is he? Oh, there you are. Okay. He's sneaky, too. So Mike Young is the Associate Director of Campaigns and Organizing with the California League of Conservation Voters, where he has worked since 2005. Mike has served on a number of boards of progressive organizations, including Black Women for Wellness Action Project, LA Forward, and the West San Fernando Valley Pals. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Philosophy from Pepperdine University. And this will be interesting for our District 48 debate. He has an undergraduate certification in dispute resolution. Welcome, Mike Young.
Thanks so much. I've been told I have my work cut out for me. I want to thank everyone again for coming out here today. For a couple of quick reminders. First, please remember, if you haven't already, a lot of people came in late, please turn down your phones or at least set them to vibrate. Second, we'd really appreciate it if everyone held their applause until the end. A lot of times the applause actually takes away some of the time that we want our candidates to have so that they can actually be more elaborate in their answers. To give you an idea, if you want to support a candidate, however, we are big fans of jazz hands, so feel free to do that. Yeah, everyone's doing it really, really well. Congratulations. And if you don't like something, feel free to give a big thumbs down. If you have some other method of doing it silently, please do. But, you know, please be respectful. To let you all know, we did, for tonight's event, invite Dana Rohrabacher. I know. We had to, right? Thank you. That's the right attitude. I appreciate that. He said he was a little busy. He's busy making fun of homeless people for being poor. It's been a very, very interesting time with him. But this was not from a lack of actually trying. They did spend a genuine amount of time trying to get him to come. And a big part of that is because part of your duty as being a member of Congress is being responsive to your constituents. So he should be here. Absolutely should be here. Thank you. I will accept the applause. I have no shame. Unfortunately, he's not here, but you are, and that's the important part. And what we really want you to do is pay attention, help us vet these candidates tonight. And more importantly, after today, and some of you have been doing it already, please be out there registering people to vote, encouraging people to come out and vote and participate in the election, knock on doors, make phone calls. And really, June 5th is a really important day for a lot of us here. Now, second, the four gentlemen, first, to give you a sense of the rules of how we picked the candidates who are up here, the four gentlemen I'm going to call up are the four candidates that had the highest scores in Indivisible's Indivisible's voter support score. The voter support score takes in a number of in-district donors, district donations, cash on hand. It creates a general score based on in-district support, which all of these candidates have been very effective in different ways of achieving. And then before tonight ends, one quick reminder, we will actually have a straw poll that we'd want everyone here in the audience to please vote and help us get a sense of how did our candidates do. We want to know. We want to hear from you. Your voice is important, and democracy wouldn't work without you. And then before I welcome the candidates on the stage, I'd like for us to take a moment to actually thank Laura Oatman. I think you all know her. You've put the importance of the country over yourself, and that's a debt we could never repay. But we tried, and so actually the first round of our event is a yes-no round, and we are actually calling it the Oatman round in your honor. To let everyone know, a lot of the questions that you're going to be hearing tonight weren't just composed by us, but a lot of you actually had submitted questions, and people who couldn't be here in attendance had submitted questions. So this is a compilation of questions that a lot of people and a lot of constituents had. So we really look forward to seeing what people say. Now I'd like to announce the candidates on stage, starting from the lowest to highest voter support score. First, we have Michael Kotick. They're all back there, so take your time. This is the time you can applaud. It's still okay. We have some dead air. It's fine. It's not a big deal. Go for it. But this will be the last time we get to do that until the end. And then we have Omar Siddiqui. Great, thank you. Dr. Hans Keirstead. And then last but not least, Harley Rouda. Great. Thanks, everyone. So we're going to start with the opening round. And to give everyone a sense of the rules, candidates are only allowed to raise green and red paddles, yes or no, to answer each of these questions. With the exception of each of you has a yellow paddle. And if you want to elaborate on a yes or no question, you may do so 2 times of the 15 questions we are about to ask. Great. So the first question. Do you accept the science of human-caused climate change?
I'm colorblind. What are we doing? Green?
Green, yeah. We appreciate that, and sorry about that.
Okay, good.
Second question, do you accept evolution?
Say it again.
Do you accept evolution? Do you support the Cadiz water project that will take water from underneath Joshua Tree and pipe it over to Los Angeles?
Sorry, I'm not that coordinated. I'm trying to figure it out here.
No worries. Do you support the construction of the Poseidon desalination plant? If you're elected...
I think it's supposed to be yellow, right? It's yellow to you, but it's not yellow to us. The car?
Oh.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I did not see that. Okay.
I just think it's a very nuanced question about that plan. I hope we go in deeper on it later.
Okay. And Michael, did you have a...
If we're going to go in deeper on it, we can all do it together, that's for sure. Is that a question that's coming?
It is not. So
Okay.
this is a good time to do it.
Let's do it. So I'll start off and just say that, first of all, water is a fundamental right and something we need to plan for. That exists. That's real. I think the technology that sits under Poseidon is something we need to be exploring further. There's 2 issues that I have with it. First, a macro trend that is happening across this country about rushed environmental evaluations and the impact on our environment. And second, but certainly not least, from an economics perspective, we should not be agreeing to pay for something for 20 years that we may not need.
Okay. Mr. Rouda?
Sure. I believe first and foremost, Huntington Beach should have the decision-making process as to whether this should be built. Second, that it passes all EPA regulations and other regulations as promulgated under the Obama administration. Third, that any economic impact of the developer being wrong sit on the shoulders of the developer. And fourth, making sure that if it does need to be built, that it's built in the right place, and it's very questionable whether Huntington Beach is the right place.
Is that, okay.
As an environmental engineer and an environmental lawyer, I oppose the Poseidon water project because it is a matter of environmental justice, that it actually hurts us, hurts the environment, makes taxpayers pay for a project that we do not need in this fashion. Dana supports it. Not that I oppose anything that Dana opposes, but the fact that he supports it, it says a lot too. It raises water rates on low-income, underprivileged families the most. It's opposed by the local community. And like the plant in Carlsbad, these projects overpromise and underdeliver.
Your time is up. Thank you very much. Next question. If you're elected, will you have a staffer specifically dedicated to environmental issues? For the last decade, a scientific consensus has been growing that neonicotinoid pesticides are a significant culprit in killing our bees and other pollinators. Would you support a ban on neonicotinoids? Do you support ending government subsidies for oil companies? The Superfund program was meant to hold industries and businesses accountable for polluting communities across the country. For years, petroleum, chemical, and corporate taxes imposed by Congress funded the vast majority of the Superfund program, including expensive cleanups. But since the Superfund taxes expired in 1995, the burden of paying the costs has shifted dramatically towards taxpayers, upwards of $21 billion. Congressman Frank Pallone has authored a bill to bring the Superfund tax back. Will you support this bill? There are over 40 native nations with ancestral territories along California's coast. Both native nations with ancestral homelands in the area now known as Orange County, the Tongva and the Achuman, are actively opposing offshore oil drilling. If elected, would you stand with the tribes of Orange County and oppose offshore oil drilling along with it? Okay. Will you sign on as a co-sponsor, not just vote for, the Merkley-Sanders bill, 100 by 50? It's 100% renewable energy by 2050, and it's House equivalent. Yeah. If elected, will you sign on as a co-sponsor, not just vote for, Tulsi Gabbard's Off Fossil Fuels Act, calling for 100% renewable energy by 2035? Do you support fracking, acidization, or any other types of extraction methods? Okay. So we'll go in order by the rank. So Mr. Rouda, I think you had yours first. Was that a red or was that a? Oh, it was a red. Okay. Sorry, some of you have the pink.
You're colorblind too?
So the pink is yellow. It's weird, right? So the pink is yellow. So it looked pink on my end from the lighting. Did anyone have mean to put the yellow card?
Yeah, we just had to flip it over.
Yeah, okay, because some people put up the pink for the yellow. Sorry about that. Okay, that's great then. In 2017, acting against the recommendations of staff scientists, the EPA refused to ban chloropyrifos, a chemical used in pesticides that is acutely toxic and associated with neural development harms in children. Will you support additional legislation to ensure children and other individuals are protected from harmful chemicals and pesticides despite potentially contrary political influences? Do you drive a 100% electric car? Do you have solar panels in your home? Scientists have confirmed that giving up beef and red meat would be a better way for people to cut carbon emissions rather than giving up their cars because of the land and resource consumption used to raise cattle. Do you eat beef or red meat?
No.
Sometimes.
No. Beef or red meat?
Beef, okay. The Supreme Court ruling on Citizens United has resulted in an unprecedented amount of campaign spending, as money is now considered a form of free speech. Since the decision, the Koch brothers and other billionaires and millionaires have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on campaigns and races at the local, state, and federal levels. Would you support a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United? The No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge states, I pledge not to take contributions from the oil, gas, and coal industry, and instead prioritize the health of our families, climate, and democracy over fossil fuel industry profits. Taking the pledge means that a candidate's campaign will adopt a policy to not knowingly accept any contributions over $200 from PACs, executives, or front groups of fossil fuel companies. Companies whose primary business is the extraction, processing, distribution, or sale of oil, gas, or coal. Will you pledge not to take any campaign contributions from the oil industry? Thank you. And similarly, will you denounce any oil company activity if they get involved in this race, even if it supports your campaign?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Would you denounce any oil company campaign activity, even if it supports your campaign? Okay, so thank you.
It's great.
And lastly, is Donald Trump a stable genius?
Really?
Great, thank you.
That was the Laura Oatman special right there.
Okay, now we shall move on to the standard questions. I apologize. I actually forgot about the candidate statements. So before we start this round, we'd like to let each of the candidates make their opening statements by the voter score order. So the first in that order is Mr. Rouda.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone coming out tonight. I appreciate it. It's about a week and a half ago that Laura Oatman stepped out of the race and endorsed our campaign. And I will tell you, I was both humbled and honored. I was honored because Laura's stand on environmental issues and her plan for America 2050 is spot on what we need to do. We talked about 2 bills earlier in the question and answer, and we need to do more than that because climate change is the greatest issue facing us, our children, and our grandchildren and generations to come. And the reason it's the greatest issue is the fact that our entire homes, cities, and farms have all been built on predictable weather patterns over the last 1,000 years. And if we change those predictable weather patterns, guess what? This is an infrastructure problem well beyond the widening of the 405. It means everywhere we have built our homes, our farms, and our cities are in the wrong place. Now, that's the doomsday side of it. But there's a plus here. There's an opportunity because those people, those groups, those industries, those communities who embrace clean tech and green tech and create the jobs of tomorrow can help solve the world's problems. And I'm committed, as your representative, to doing just that, and I hope to earn your vote. Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Keirstead.
Well, thank you. And thanks all of you for coming tonight. It's really good to see everyone. I developed my love for the environment growing up on a farm, and then I moved to the mountains in order to be closer to it still throughout much of my adult life. I find myself on in this beautiful district where the natural beauty for us is our beautiful air, our gorgeous skies, and our beautiful beaches and water. So yes, I'm an active member of conservatories, and yes, I cruise the beach every week picking up garbage and paddleboard picking up garbage out of the water. But I'm sure everyone up here absolutely loves the environment. I'm sure all of you do. I want you to know what I can offer you as a representative in this regard. The EPA has more scientists in it than any other department besides the health-caring ones. It is essentially a scientific issue, and I'm a scientist. I'm a neuroscientist, but I've served on panels that range from everything from brain to environment, to water, to air, to plastics. You see, they pervade everything. It's not just the air and the water. It's the soother that you put in your child's mouth. It's the seats that you're sitting on. And did the trade agreement have a scientist at the table looking after the environmental effect of the toxins in that chair? So when it goes to the land dump, it doesn't end up in our water and in our food. So that's what I'll promise you as a representative, a seat at the table to make this right again. Thank you.
Mr. Siddiqui.
Thank you. We'll definitely address environmental issues, but there's 2 issues that I want to address now that's of serious concern for all of us. First, as many of you may know, at the YouTube headquarters today, there was a shooting, 4 wounded. It is a reminder that gun reform is needed. It is well overdue. Enough is enough, and we cannot wait for the next time to happen. It's only a matter of time. Another issue that I want to bring that's not environmentally related is that there's a wave of hate going through Orange County in the various city council meetings. I had a run-in with Dana Rohrbacher last night at the Huntington Beach City Council, where the city council was considering suing the state, given the SB 54 sanctuary state. The amount of hate that was in that room, the amount of anger that was in that room, the amount of prejudice was in that room was shocking. And it was especially shocking because tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. I remind all of you, please attend these city council meetings. Tonight there was one in Fountain Valley. I was hoping to be there as well, but obviously I'm here. Tomorrow is at Aliso Viejo. Please, at the Aliso Viejo City Council, this makes a big difference. If we do not come and stand up for our immigrants, no one's going to. We need the Democratic Party. Bat signals in the air.
And Mr. Kotick.
All right. Good evening, everybody. How are we doing? Good. My name is Michael Kotick, and I usually start off talking a little bit about my background and the things that I've done, but particularly in regards to the environment today, my job tonight is going to be to continuously provide perspective on how the environment connects to everything else that's going on in our country right now. The fact of the matter is we have a president and a Congress who is complicit in this action, who have given $1.5 trillion in tax cuts, who have approved a spending bill that has contributed to our deficit another $1 trillion. And they are going straight after environmental relaxation of regulations to pay for that debt, something that we will be repaying over and over and over again over the course of the next 10 years at the very least. So let's think forward. Let's think about our children. Let's think about our children's children. And let's think about what we're putting a generation of Americans through. We're putting a generation of Americans through unprecedented debt, large deficits at a national level. We're putting them through not being treated when it comes to different types of addictions and opioids, and now we are going to threaten the very thing that they can rely on in the long term for their health, and that is the planet around them. This is a dire situation. This is the first step in a very long conversation that we need, and we need representation in Congress to make sure that we step up and really correct the actions that have been taken. Thank you.
Thank you all. Now we can go to the general questions. Each of you will have 60 seconds to answer each of these answer the questions that are directed to you. If you are asked the follow-up question, you'll have 30 seconds to respond. This question is actually for all of you, and you'll be asked in order of the voter scores. What are the country's biggest challenges to taking meaningful action to combat climate change? And how do you plan to overcome those challenges? Be specific in describing what actions you would take in your first year. First goes to Mr. Rouda.
First and foremost, we need a government, a federal government that recognizes climate change is real and needs to be addressed immediately. Most studies show that 2050 is a turning point at the continued heating of the Earth. And as Laura and I have talked about before, it's important that that actually be moved up to 2030. We need to cool this planet down. How do we do that? Two of the key ways is renewable energy, specifically wind and solar. And by the way, nuclear and natural gas is not renewable energies in spite of what some people would like us to think. So let's get that off the table. We also have other opportunities through geothermal and a host of other ones. And we need to embrace it not just at the federal level, but also the state and local. And what's so amazing is that with Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord with Rohrabacher's support, mayors and governors have stepped up and made sure that our country is on track to do the best we can. But there's more we can do. Thank you.
Dr. Keirstead.
So you asked for specific actions we would take. Well, I think that we need to reverse a lot of the quiet ills that the Trump administration has put into place. And they are a whole host of things, like removing the disclosure requirements for fracking toxins, like the use of natural lands now, like the elimination of the safety budgets that all the fossil fuel companies have to have. I could go on. There are all of the nits and picks that they've been systematically denigrating. We need to reverse those. But in general, what we really need to stand by is the Clean Water Act, the Safe Water Drinking Act, the Antiquities Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. We need to stand by the Endangered Species Act. We need to stand by the Arctic National Refuge Act. And on the energy side, which is the other half of the equation besides the environment, we need to restore the $7,500 credit for EVs, remove the 200,000 unit limits, and back the Energy Regulation Committee.
Sorry. Mr. Siddiqui.
Thank you. When asked about climate change, Dana Rohrabacher says he's not a scientist, but for some reason, when it comes to a woman's right to choose, all of a sudden he's a doctor. What we need to do, what the first thing I will do when elected to Congress, is I will allocate more resources into the one agency that has been historically a champion for environmental causes, and that is the Environmental Protection Agency. The Environmental Protection Agency has to be at the forefront of protecting both our air, water, and ground contamination. We need a strong EPA to allocate government resources and put them in the right place and where we need them. The Superfund site was an excellent project to alleviate major waste throughout our country. Another thing that we should do is ensure that we have leaders, elect leadership that has respect for science and climate change. We cannot have congressmen like Dana Rohrabacher ignoring the facts of science.
And Mr. Kotick.
So Congress in 2017 passed, I believe, at least on the House side, 37 different legislative actions to roll back different environmental protections. 37. So we can talk about and we can list them all out, but I only have 60 seconds, so I'm going to skip ahead to the big parts. I think one of the biggest challenges for us is while we all hold environmental protection as a high value, there is an entire other side of the country that doesn't see it, that sees it as an impediment to advancing business. That is simply not the case. As Harley mentioned earlier, it is very much so a gateway to a new economy. I think the first step that we need to take is we need to be looking at reinstating these studies that help us understand what the social cost of carbon is and what the opportunities are for businesses to advance and make sure that renewable energies become part of their pipelines into the future, and we can bridge the gap through the mix of both environmental principles and business advancement.
This next question is again for all four of you. Earth Overshoot Day is the day each year in which humanity's resource consumption has overshot what the Earth can naturally regenerate in a year. In 1987, Earth Overshoot Day was December 19th. In 2017, it was August 2nd. While individual actions to reduce consumption does add up, it's clearly not doing enough because Earth Overshoot Day is happening sooner and sooner each year. The US is the biggest contributor per person in the world to shifting Earth Overshoot Day. So what do you feel is the government's role in addressing this issue? And Mr. Rouda, you're first.
The government has to take the lead role, as I spoke about earlier, whether it's federal, state, and local. There are studies out there that show the shift to renewables has a great opportunity to eliminate the continued heating of our planet and actually do a drawdown of carbon dioxide in the air. There's a study from Stanford University that shows if we move to renewables, again, primarily through wind and solar, that we would delay 7 million premature deaths, save $20 million in expenses, $20 trillion in expenses associated with climate change, and create 24 million new jobs. We have to have a sustainability revolution with the speed of the digital revolution and the intensity of the industrial revolution. It is time for all of us to recognize we have a role in maintaining our planet and saving our planet. And it's all levels of government, and it's all of us as individuals.
Dr. Keirstead?
You know, I think that the essence of the question is, what do we do about sustainable energy, but also sustainable products? So sustainable energy, Kevin DeLeon just put a bill forward that advances the targets for our reduction of oil use so that we move forward onto an energy efficient grid. 100% by 2050 instead of just 50% by 2050. In order to do that, we're going to have to change our infrastructure a great deal. So we've got an energy system now that needs to be reworked. You know, we had Pruitt and Perry telling us that they will not allow alternative sources onto our grid because it messes up the flow of the 60 hertz one-way energy flow through our grid. It's absolutely wrong. We have to allow these alternate methods onto the grid.
Sorry, your time is up.
Okay, sorry.
Mr. Siddiqui.
Thank you. I think as an environmental engineer and as an environmental lawyer, this question pertains directly to what are we going to do about energy policy? Point blank, we are the most advanced nation on the planet. We need energy. We are a small fraction of the Earth's population, but we use a significant portion of the energy. What does that mean? That means our government, our Congress, should initiate programs to incentivize businesses and individuals to invest in the economy and the future. How so? For example, we should enhance the $7,500 tax credit for driving an electric vehicle. We should support a cap and trade system where companies are incentivized to minimize their carbon footprint. We should tag team with companies like Tesla and EVgo and establish nationwide electric vehicles and EV charging stations. We should support solar installations. We should invest in solar wind technologies. We should make sure that our infrastructure is set up to support that.
And Mr. Kotick.
So I agree that a clean energy revolution needs to happen. I think we can all agree on that up here. I think the challenge that exists is what do we do between now and then? And the fact is we've made incredible progress when it comes to things like the Clean Air Act. We've seen, I don't know if you guys remember this, but when I was a kid, I was actually not allowed to go out for recess on multiple occasions because we had smog alerts. But we reduced those things, right? We regulated tailpipe emissions. We reduced carbon monoxide. We reduced so many different greenhouse gases that are important, and those are all being rolled back as we speak, and not even giving California the opportunity to fight for the environmental principles that we know are right. That needs to be the first step, and we need to simultaneously make sure that we're planning for the future.
This next question is for Mr. Rouda. We're fortunate to live in a district that's relatively affluent and has relative power to prevent disasters like the long-time and continuous poisoning of drinking water in Flint, Michigan. To this day, Flint still does not have access to clean drinking water. Do you think it's the responsibility of members of Congress to work for communities that don't have similar power, even if it's not your home district? And if so, how would you work to help other less affluent or powerful communities?
Absolutely. It is the government's job to make sure there is clean, potable water everywhere in the United States. That's an absolute obligation to the citizens, as well as many other obligations. I would hope that the federal government would step in all communities and districts where they do not have safe, healthy drinking water. If that means replacing the pipes, if that means redoing the treatment plants to assure that they have healthy water, that's what needs to be done. That has to be at the top of the list of what our government stands for: safety and security and the stability of our communities. And water plays a clear part in doing so.
In that note, how would you find out? What efforts do you think, and what obligations does a member of Congress have to find out what's happening in other communities, to find out if there are these kinds of problems?
Well, I think it's actually pretty simple because, first of all, most of it's public news. Second, there's testing of water nonstop. All drinking water across the United States has ongoing testing to make sure it is healthy and drinkable. And in the event that testing is revealing systematic degradation in drinkable water, then it is the job of the local, state, and federal government to step in. It should be local and state government addressing it first, but if they are incapable, unwilling, or for other reasons, potentially unethical reasons for not addressing it, the federal government has to step in.
Great. Next question is for Dr. Keirstead. President Trump has made his intentions to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Accords very clear. This would leave the US as the only country not to sign on. And in response, state and local municipalities have declared their intentions to meet and exceed the Accord's climate commitments. What can Congress do to support these efforts? What specifically would you do as a Congress member to support these efforts?
Well, you know, when we have 97% of scientists telling us that climate change is real and we contribute to it, and I'm one of them, I think we need to listen. When we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the UN, and when we have the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States, telling us that we contribute to climate change, we need to listen. Did you know in March, Chevron, leading all of the oil companies, admitted that humans are responsible for climate change? We need to plug the loopholes in all of our protections that currently exist, loopholes that are being granted to all of our fossil fuel producers. So the National Environmental Policy Act is very strong on protecting water for all constituents and all over the United States. The EPA has measurements. The Clean Water Act has regulations, all of which are waived for most of our oil producers. We've got to plug every single one of those loopholes and bring the regulations that were once put into office back into applicability to every single energy producer.
And sorry, did you say specifically what you could do as a Congress member? Like, do you have any specific goals that, or legislative goals that you might have in mind?
Yeah, where it's plugging every one of the loopholes in the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Safe Drinking Water Act. Those are the three primary acts that the loopholes are being used for all of the major fossil fuel producers, including all of the offshore oil producers.
Mr. Siddiqui, in April 2017, Donald Trump signed an executive order that triggered a review of all national monuments that have been created under the Antiquities Act since 1991. Following that review, the Department of the Interior has already started a process to reduce the boundaries of some of those sites, which have been deemed of national importance. This includes Bears Ears National Monument and Grand Staircase, both in Utah. How can members of Congress that don't represent the district in states that these threatened public spaces are within protect those sites?
Thank you. Well, when it comes to public lands, let's be clear. Those are national treasures that need to be protected. Those, once they're lost, we can't get them back. I oppose oil drilling. I want to join forces with all like-minded congressmen and women who are going to fight together to ensure that we do not drill for oil on our national parks. I want to preserve those national parks. As you mentioned, I oppose the move to reduce the Bear Ears National Monument by that 85%. I oppose the Interior Secretary's move to nearly double the entrance fees to these national parks. If the administration is pressed for cash, well, take it from that silly wall or these military parades. I oppose any attempt to mine and exploit the Grand Canyon. This will cause habitat fragmentation, which is non-reversible. Another thing that I will do is make sure that we work very closely and respect our Native American groups and citizens, and make sure that we protect their sacred lands as well from economic exploitation and economic devastation. We've done a lot to our Native Americans historically. It's time that our Congress also pay attention to them. Public lands are meant for public to enjoy and explore, not for big oil to destroy. I'm currently the attorney fighting Chevron to preserve Coyote Hills, one of the largest land parcels left here in Orange County. I'm fighting that in the California Appellate Court. So not only do I not take big oil money, I'm fighting big oil.
You mentioned the importance of having local input on these decisions. What happens if there is local input that supports reducing these boundaries? This was the problem that we actually saw in a number of national monuments here in California, where we had certain logging industries, for instance, who were local, for instance, in the Greater Sequoia, in the Giant Sequoia National Monument, that asked for this. How do you respond to that problem?
Well, one thing we need to do is educate. Because what seems to be happening is a lot of these lobbies, they put money into the pockets of your leaders to give them the right to drill, log, and pillage our national resources. So what we need to do is we need to elect leadership that knows how to look big oil in the face and say, we're not going to take your money. We don't need your PAC money. That's the problem with the NRA. That's the problem with big oil. That's the problem with Dana Rohrabacher, is they're accepting this money and they're compromising our values.
This question is for Mr. Kotick. Since his election, Trump and his administration, including Secretary of Interior Ryan Zinke and the head of EPA Scott Pruitt, have been systemically working to eliminate key environmental regulations and protective policies. If elected, how would you begin to work to repair the damage that's been done thus far, and how do you prioritize what needs to be addressed first?
There's 37 things that they've done, so we're going to have some work to do. I think first and foremost, there are some key things that we need to address that are fundamentally crippling the influence in Washington, D.C. right now. First and foremost, there are a lot of transparency initiatives that have been introduced that allow big oil companies to contribute to campaigns and not disclose. A lot of things have been introduced that are genuinely derailing our abilities to have transparency and understand who are pulling the strings. I think we first and foremost need to do that, and we also need to put scientists back on the EPA board, which has also been limited, and fundamentally recommit to the progress that we need to make for clean air and clean water. I know it sounds simple, but that is under attack right now, and those are the things that we need to shore up. And from that point forward, I think offshore drilling is the next thing that we need to make sure that we roll back, because those are meant to be a reserve under President Truman. And you do not drill into a reserve when you have so many other options for us to be moving forward, like renewable energies. I don't understand why America has a for sale sign out front right now, but it is not acceptable and we cannot stand for it.
Mr. Rouda, do you agree with that?
I agree with it, yes, in part. I recognize, though, that from our standpoint that we need to be focused on the renewable energies first and foremost, as I've said repeatedly, and would stand by that as well.
And Dr. Keirstead?
Yeah, I do. I'd add one specific that will help us along the way to what Mr. Kotick is espousing. We saw that the Energy Regulation Committee is now being forced, it rejected it, by Perry and Pruitt to add oil to the mix of energies, even in California where we don't use it. We've got to be able to push back and strengthen that committee so that they have the wherewithal to stand up and say no. We are going to say no locally on every single district in this nation.
Mr. Siddiqui, every piece of plastic ever created is still with us on this planet. While recycling is important, it only addresses a small fraction of the problem, and many single-use plastics can't be included in the recycling infrastructure. The real solution is eliminating new plastic from entering our ecosystem in the first place. Several states, including California, have now created statewide bans in single-use plastic bags. And we're now seeing some cities looking to ban other single-use plastic bags, like other plastics in general, like straws, plastic cutlery, and water bottles. Is there a role for the federal government in stemming the tide of plastic? And in what way would you address this if you're elected?
Thank you for that question. That's actually an excellent question, because what it does is it shows the differences between what your local government can do and what we as the federal government can do. For example, as you know, now it's been several months now, whenever you go to the store, most people forget their bags, run to the car like I do, come back in, and now you're bagging groceries. How many have that problem? I knew it. Right. No thumbs down, I see there. But what needs to happen, essentially, is that's at the local level. But what the federal government needs to do, the federal government needs to make sure that we can equalize it and make that standard throughout the United States. Because if we solve it at a local level, let's just say California is entirely green, but we have a state like Texas that's entirely not green. What's that going to do for us? Nothing, because you have one state polluting all of these plastics. So what needs to happen is we need to have baseline federal regulation that the states should meet at a bare minimum. And if you have states like California, New York, Illinois, who want to exceed those, by all means, go for it. And I think what we can also do in Congress is we can incentivize it for the states. For example, we need to make sure that if you, California, or you, Wyoming, you're able to exceed the federal minimum, you will get additional subsidies, additional benefits from the federal government to augment your environmental program, to build your environmental infrastructure.
One of the problems we had in the state when we were trying to implement the bag ban is that local municipalities had inconsistencies. So are you suggesting, in the process of building this federal infrastructure, or this federal baseline, that it would just supersede any local jurisdiction control?
Well, in the legal world, you call that the Erie Doctrine. As an environmental lawyer, the challenge becomes, well, when the federal government sets a baseline, how far can the states go above or below? But when you have a federal law, states cannot cut the intention of federal law. They must meet those minimum guidelines. So what I'm saying here is, as long as the federal government can establish that baseline, Mike, what needs to happen there is states then should look at that baseline and look at that as a bottom line, what the states need to achieve.
Hey, Mike, can I get in on that?
Sure. I'll let that happen.
I'll be brief.
Okay.
Right now, the forecast is that the poundage of plastic in our oceans by 2050 will outweigh the poundage of fish in our ocean. Yes, and much of it is microscopic. The banning of bags, plastic bags, as an example, has been proven in municipalities to cut down on the amount of trash in the municipality as well as what gets into the oceans. And there are at least a half dozen states who have passed legislation banning bans. So in the federal government, I would fight to reverse that.
one he just mentioned? So the study about the plastic in the oceans is being contested at this moment. There are questions on whether or not it's scientifically sound. So I think we should continue to find out if that is factually true before making that or saying that constantly as fact.
Mike, if I may address that real quick.
Sorry, we have to actually move on,
right.
so I appreciate that. Next question is from Mr. Kotick. The UK, France, and China have made pledges to phase out and ban sales of internal combustion engines. Do you believe the US should do the same? And if so, how quickly should that happen? And what would we need to do to get us to the point that we'd be prepared to do that?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing is the rest of the world moving a little bit faster than us when it comes to renewables and it comes to environmental policy since the Trump administration took office. Now, there are economic effects that we are seeing, right? The EU said no new trade agreements with those who haven't signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement, and we are in a bit of a pickle there, frankly, because Congress can't authorize the Paris Climate Agreement. So we need to move things forward when we do flip the House in 2018 to ensure that we continue to chart the path towards the goals that we had originally set. Now, we can do that from a legislative perspective. To answer your question specifically, and I will tell you, I am not a scientist, nor do I have those projections. I hear things like 2035 and 2050, and all of those things are good. But I think we need to get experts in a room, which is what people in Washington, D.C. are not doing, and have an honest conversation between communities, scientists, and businesses to ensure we can chart that path together. Because actually the most fundamental thing that I saw about mileage changes that the Trump administration is looking to roll back, fuel efficiency, is businesses struggle with inconsistency. I think we need to set goals together, we need to get to goals together, and we need to make sure it's consistent from administration to administration so we can achieve goals. That's what needs to happen. Mr. Rouda, natural gas has been called a bridge fuel to help us make the transition to new renewable energy. You talked about it previously. Do you agree with that statement?
No, I do not.
What would you do? How would we get there instead?
The focus has to be on micro-targeting renewable energies and sustainability community by community. That involves everything from, as we've discussed numerous times here, thermal, geothermal, wind, solar, but it also means doing that in microgrids and micro ways within the communities. All of us have the ability to reduce our footprint, our carbon footprint, by creating opportunities to create renewable energies at home. In addition, we have the ability to reduce our needs on plastic. We have the ability to bring farming closer to home and reduce our impact there as well. You touched on it early, reducing the consumption of red meat. I think I read somewhere where if cows were a nation, they would be like 4th or 5th in methane production. So we have a real issue in how we conduct our agriculture and how we provide our energy across an outdated grid and an outdated way of thinking.
Now, one of the argument that the natural gas industry is making right now is that the technology of natural gas has actually reduced climate emissions overall compared to coal. It takes credit, and perhaps rightfully so, in helping phase out coal, but it is clearly not a zero-emission problem. Their argument is that renewable technology isn't available yet, but that their technology right now is. Would you think that, does it make sense for us to transition in any sense to using any natural gas resources?
We already have natural gas resources. We already have natural gas pipelines. So to expand it, I'm against that. We have spent over the last 15 years for every $1 of incentives from the federal government for renewable energies, we have provided $80 in subsidies for fossil fuels. So it's clear that if we shift our thinking and dedicate, and just flip that on its head, if we had $80 dedicated to renewables and $1 dedicated to fossil fuels, we'd be having a much different discussion about natural gases, how it would work going forward. So we got to change the incentives. That is absolutely clear. And if we do that, the ability to transform to renewables faster than anticipated gets very easy.
It's funny you mentioned that, because Dr. Keirstead, right now the EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, has said that he wants to cut subsidies for renewable energy companies, arguing that they need to stand on their own 2 feet like the oil industry. In reality, that's right. More of this. In reality, the oil industry has actually received $500 billion in federal subsidies over the course of the last 100 years. That's an average of $5.5 billion a year, adjusted for inflation. Meanwhile, renewable energy sources like wind received, on average, less than $500 million a year, less than a tenth of how much oil gets, even though energy investments up front are always the most expensive point. So how are renewable energy companies supposed to compete when federal subsidies have tipped the scales to the oil industry's favor?
You know, it's a two-part answer to that. But first, we absolutely have to decarbonize. There is no reason why decarbonization equals job loss, as the Trump administration is trying to propagate. Decarbonization means job creation in this country. We are working on a system that is antiquated and full of exemptions. In my previous answer, I stated about a half dozen agencies, all of which have loopholes for oil companies, for all fossil fuel producers. In addition, all the removal of fines has been put onto only them, not clean energy producers. It's time that we shift things over to subsidizing those energy creation, energy creators, funding ARPA-E, which is a research arm for clean energy, rather than defund it, which is what Trump has said. And in addition, the Energy Regulation Committee right now is being forced, as I said, by Perry to include oil in its mix. We don't need oil in its mix here. We don't use it. The grid is now receiving all types of energies, and peaker plants from natural gas are the biggest polluters besides transportation in this nation. They can now be completely replaced with wind and solar. We've got to move that way with regulation and subsidy.
Mr. Siddiqui, if a technology powerhouse such as Google can operate on a carbon-neutral footprint, what type of legislation would you propose to encourage other corporations or industries to move towards more carbon-neutral or carbon-positive operations?
I love this question because essentially it goes back to what I am championing for, is that having a green environment and a green economy are not mutually exclusive. We can have a cap-and-trade system that encourages companies like Google, like the Fortune 500 companies, like small businesses to protect the environment. One of my favorite programs that I keep monitoring is the CAP program. What that program does is an example of it is the one that's in San Diego, the 2015 CAP program, where environmental, business, and community leaders came together. And their purposes were the following. Number one, reduce greenhouse gases. Two, aim for renewable sources. And what that essentially did is that created new jobs in the renewable energy industry. It created new improved public health and air quality. It conserved water. It made efficient use of the limited resources that they had. And what it does is it promoted an environment where companies wanted to be a part of this. I think what needs to happen is, like many buildings, are LEED environmentally friendly buildings. Companies now want that designation. You all may remember you had those big hefty computer monitors that had the big thick backs, and you would have the Energy Star compliant because you had companies trying to comply with the energy issues. We need to have more positive enforcement from our government to promote environmental technology.
We have a series of really fantastic fact checkers, and I want to thank them for their work. One of the things that we wanted to fact check because of a statement that was made earlier was Mr. Rouda's comment about the amount of biomass plastics compared to fish. At this moment in time, Science magazine says that this is not true, or at least unclear. So the science is actually not out on that being the case, that plastic is more biomass than the fish at this moment in time.
Did you check the Washington Post article that actually confirms it?
Yes, these are checked by, and these studies were checked by references to Science magazine too. So.
Yeah, I didn't say now. I said 2050, that there are projections.
And yes, that they've still looked at that they find that inconclusive.
but not wrong. That, in other words, there are scientists. Sorry, it's the lawyer of me coming out. But I'm pretty sure Washington Post doesn't publish statements that by 2050 that there's a chance that the amounts of plastic in the water will equal fish without some level of substance to that statement. Agreed?
Sure. I think we will let our voters decide on that.
Well, if it's even 30% or 40%, we should all be damn scared.
Mr. Kotick, Sweden has had a carbon tax since 1991 and has seen their emissions reduced 25%, while their GDP has increased 60%. China has implemented a cap-and-trade system and has seen their carbon emissions plateau and level out in the last 3 years. Are you in favor of implementing a carbon tax or a carbon cap-and-trade system? And if so, who or what should be taxed?
Okay, so Harley, also Sweden does great with trash too, so we're all set there. So cap and trade. I think cap and trade is something that, frankly, we have seen some tremendous success with in California, but quite frankly, there's some kinks to iron out, right? We've seen some things in terms of the credits not exactly equalizing each other, the market's having some fluctuations. That being said, I firmly believe, and this comes from my background in business, that you are what you measure. So if you measure your carbon output and you have to either pay for that or trade for that, you are going to change behavior. That is simple. The hows of it, again, we all need to get in a room and figure how we continually optimize a cap and trade system, but it also continues to how we measure emissions in general. I don't know if you know this, but the Clean Power Plan that was set by President Obama set a threshold for what good emissions were, or good enough, or best-in-class emissions were. And every single form, whether it was coal or natural gas, had to hit the same measurement platform to be acceptable. Since the Trump administration, every single form of energy now has its own hurdle of measurement. So coal can have a higher hurdle of measurement than natural gas. Again, we are not progressing towards a better system. We are simply giving people a way to continue the same behavior, and that is the type of thing that we need to address in Washington, D.C., starting in 2018, if not sooner.
One of the things that cap and trade actually also has trouble addressing is being equal amongst all different communities. A lot of times the carbon credits that are traded don't benefit communities of color, disadvantaged communities, the most impacted communities in general. What can we do to improve cap and trade systems to make that a possibility?
You know, I think there's a number of different things that are happening. Specifically, I don't know the answer to that question. I think that is something that consistently comes up. And something that we definitely need to look at. But I think even across the EPA standards overall and how they've changed over the course of the last year, we've seen the impact of what can happen in, frankly, communities of color and or those who are less fortunate. We see a relaxation of stream contamination coming from coal mining that disproportionately affects disadvantaged communities. We need to be looking out for everyone, and I'm seeing stop here, so I'm going to stop.
Thanks. Mr. Rouda, the Endangered Species Act is one of the U.S.'s bedrock environmental regulations. Supporters of the act say this legislation is critical for protecting threatened and endangered species and their habitats. Critics of the act state that it's overly bureaucratic, slows economic development, and puts undue burdens on developers. What's your opinion?
I'm proud of the fact that the author of that legislation, Congressman Pete McCloskey, has endorsed our campaign. And so I think that's sufficient to say I support it 100%. I think those who say it's bureaucratic and stands in the way of progress don't recognize how important our biodiversity is to current generations as well as future generations. And on the Hill, I will continue to support it 100% and all those who attempt to diminish it.
Dr. Keirstead, the Trump administration recently reversed the ban on importing elephant trophies. And and will allow importation of elephant trophies on a case-by-case basis. How can Congress act to prevent the killing and importation of endangered species like elephants?
Well, Endangered Species Act is one thing to back, but that's not going to, right now, stop elephant tusks from being imported. But there are regulations that we can put into place and several other acts on importation. what this does is it brings up the question of trade and environmental and species protection in trade partnerships. That is the point where Congress acts to regulate importation of things like tusks. And what has happened in the history of this country and what has been added to by the Trump administration to really no cap at all, like to unlimited amounts, has been corporate seats at the table with no environmentalists at the table, no activists at the table, no individuals with special interests like their state of socioeconomic development or color at the table. So what we're seeing is a kowtowing to larger corporations. TPP was a perfect example of that, where environmental agencies were not at the table at all. This is the type of legislation that we could put into place, monitoring that, and we sure as hell need a scientist at the table for those discussions.
How did we get in? We're clearly shut off from the executive. What can Congress do to make this process more open?
Well, I think that having a balanced Congress with the administration does that. So right now, Trump is free to run because he has a red House and a red Senate. And all of the decisions are being made in closed-door sessions. It's the biggest thumb-down issue on the Hill that there is right now. We do not have the ability to even have input to our own healthcare system, our own trade systems, our own care in any way, shape, or form because the Republicans are blocking us out. Get the Hill back. Get the Hill back.
Mr. Siddiqui, actually, all of the candidates have said on record that you don't support storing nuclear waste canisters on site at the San Onofre plant. Where should it go?
That's an excellent question. And yes, we got to take the Hill back. Well, I think the Putin administration, I meant the Trump administration, doesn't really give a priority to our nuclear waste, to our Superfund sites, to our contamination. One thing's for certain is that within the geography of Orange County, San Diego, Southern California as a whole, storing that nuclear waste from San Onofre is very dangerous. What needs to happen is the federal government has, along with the EPA, has to take serious study and look at what our options are and what part of our country can sustain this nuclear waste. In engineering school, we had professors who thought of ideas of putting all of this waste in a containment unit somewhere deep in Death Valley. We had other professors who loved the idea of putting this waste, and I'm sorry, some of those were Republican professors, they would throw them into outer space on nuclear canisters as well. Bottom line is this: we cannot be irresponsible with the waste that we generate. What our country needs to do is we need to get our scientists together, get our EPA together, come up with a cost-effective solution. Yes, there's nuclear waste. No, it's not going to go away by the snap of our finger. But what we can do is create containment units within our nation to ensure that they're safe and disposed of properly without affecting anyone.
What if the results of all those studies say keep it where it is? Would you still feel the same way? Every community that we decide is going to feel the same way about not wanting them in their community. So how do you make that choice?
That's a great question. I think that's where the environmental lawyer side of me kicks in, which is, well, you need to do what's called the risk analysis. You need to see if you keep waste in the middle of San Onofre, between Southern California, between San Diego and Orange County, and the impact that could have, versus if this waste is kept in the middle of Death Valley where there's no one for hundreds of miles, where should the risk go? We have to make sure. Look, we have it. So what are we going to do with it? It's kind of like you have a snake in your house. Are you going to keep it in the bedroom, or are you going to keep it in the backyard as far away from the bedroom as possible? I would go with the latter.
Mr. Rouda, do you agree with that?
I think it's a lot more complex. It really comes down to when to move it, where to move it, and how to move it. And right now, what's being proposed by the NRC and Edison is to put it in 5/8-inch thick canisters that are completely unproven. It's a new technology that is unproven. For 40 years across the world, nuclear waste has been put in 10-inch or almost 10-inch thick canisters with a proven track record. And we need to recognize that's where we need to start. We needed to get into consistently proven, known canisters, and then we need to work on the longer-term solution as to where it should be. And one thing I do know, it should not be on the coast of California in an earthquake zone.
Mr. Kotick, the Antiquities Act, created by Theodore Roosevelt in part, has been used for the past century to allow the executive branch to designate national monuments like the San Gabriel Mountains, Greater Sequoia National Monument, and Sand and Snow National Monuments without congressional approval. Critics believe it's an overreach of the executive branch. Do you think the Antiquities Act should be weakened or revoked?
No, I think actually it's incredibly important, and I think they should be able to approve new sites and not remove them, which I think is what we're seeing right now. I mean, essentially, we are seeing multiple occasions, and we mentioned them earlier. We are seeing multiple occasions where this White House is putting a garage sale on in the front lawn. For mining, for drilling, and everything in between, we are seeing a fundamental disruption of our most precious resources now be put up for sale for different resources, whether it's drilling and mining for all the different ones in the continental 48, or even up in Alaska, we've seen fundamental changes in terms of Arctic drilling. We have some real work to do, but I think the Antiquities Act is important because, frankly, the government doesn't own it, we own it, and I think we need to protect it.
Dr. Keirstead, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree completely. The Antiquities Act is more than just monuments. It's the space that they're on. It's many of the Antiquities Act protections are land. And so we've got not only structures, but the land that they're on. And it belongs to the people. They were put there for a reason and at great local effort. So these decisions have to be a group of environmental scientists. They have to be the House, the Senate, and the administration. They have to have indigenous peoples at the table, and they have to have local administrative government at the table. That's not happening. Again, we need to take that hill back.
Mr. Rouda, California consistently has more stringent environmental standards than the rest of the country, including the federal standards that are in place. However, in order for environmental laws to be consistent across the country, federal laws that are stronger than most other states also end up being weaker than California's standards many of the times. Sometimes this means California and other states must first receive special permission in order to exceed those standards, like the Clean Air Waiver that's in the Clean Air Act. Is this a fair trade-off for California and its environmental goals?
Yes, and it's under attack as we sit here today. If you've read the papers today or the news online, you saw the Trump administration taking action against California's ability to manage its clean air as it sees fit. And we've done that with federal waivers to date, and the Trump administration is talking about reversing it on behalf of the auto companies. And I hope that we will be able to fight that in court and continue to not just lead the United States, but lead the world in environmental protection and fight it tooth and nail every way we can. And I believe we will be successful. I know we'll be successful, and here's why. Because anything that Trump tries to do in this area will take 3 or 4 years minimum in litigation, and by then we will have the House back and the White House.
So then would you support a legislative strategy? You're suggesting a legal strategy. Would you support a legislative strategy to continue this?
Yeah, that's exactly what I said. So what we do from California's standpoint is fight it in the court of law, but at the federal level, because it will take that long in a court of law for any decision to be made, by that point, I firmly believe the Democrats will have the House back, the Senate back, and the White House, and we can reverse all this crazy, stupid stuff that Trump does on a regular basis.
Dr. Keirstead, next on Trump's list of priorities, well, besides the wall, is a broad sweeping infrastructure bill. That's also not the wall, we hope. What would you do to ensure that funding allocated in this bill goes to build green infrastructure and promote a transition to renewable energy, and does not put the U.S. behind on its commitments as outlined in the Paris Agreement?
No, it's a great question. You know, if someone once asked me, is there anything at all that Trump's doing that you agree with? And the only thing are pieces of that infrastructure bill. Because what happens is it creates jobs throughout the country, and certainly in this district as well. We have 40% of the solar energy workers in the United States right here. But we are running out of jobs as we push more oil, as the administration pushes more oil and fossil fuels onto us. So we've got to use that infrastructure money in order to use it for the infrastructure for solar and wind. The first thing I would do in a very specific way is get rid of all of the peaker factories that natural gas companies have set up. When natural gas is burnt, there are clean natural gas burns and very dirty natural gas burns. Those are called the peaker because they're turned on during peak systems. It has now been shown that wind and solar energy in California can provide as much energy onto that grid as a peaker system. That will eliminate all of our, the second greatest polluter. We've got to put that into place and use the infrastructure money to do so.
Mr. Rouda, would you agree with that?
I don't. I don't agree with his infrastructure bill for several reasons. One, the infrastructure bill is set up, most of that money is being purposed as a private-public partnership. And the response of the private community has been lackluster, to say the least, because of the way it's set up. States and municipalities don't like it because it puts a greater onus on them to come up with funds as well. And it's also an attempt to basically do a roundabout on unions' involvement in these infrastructure projects. So I'm fully against the current infrastructure bill. I support an infrastructure bill. I don't support Trump's infrastructure bill.
Mr. Siddiqui, as a result of climate change, Southern California will experience higher on average temperatures and an increase in the occurrence and intensity of heat waves. The homeless are particularly vulnerable and have tripled the risk of death from heat exhaustion. In addition, homeless encampments are often located in riverbeds and channels which are at risk for flooding during intense periods of rain. Another impact of climate change. As a representative, how would you work to solve these issues the climate change posed to the homeless?
That's another great question. I had the opportunity to visit many of these homeless camps. And as you know, one judge who I had a trial before, Judge David Carter, federal judge, has been a champion to help the homeless. One thing that needs to happen in Congress, we need to make sure that the money that's allocated to help the homeless, to help in the infrastructure so they have a place to go, so they can get a meal on the table, is actually used. Right now, it's just sitting in the county's account doing nothing while human beings are suffering. What we need to do in Congress is we need to make sure that there's a massive overhaul in how our state and local governments allocate these funds and don't use these funds for political purpose and political gain. How many times are we hearing our local officials talking about how important the homeless issue is, but when it comes to creating an environment, creating a structure for the homeless, giving them an opportunity to at least go somewhere, removing them from the riverbed, okay, where they're supposed to go, and then to criminalize, being homeless. If you are at a park, there's some cities will give you a ticket for being homeless, a ticket for spending the night somewhere. This is not right. We as human beings have to ensure that if we do not respect and take care of our homeless, that's a major problem. Homelessness is a major environmental issue, one of which is in my top 3 I'm going to address in Congress.
Mr. Kotick, given the water scarcity is the new norm in California, and the demand seems to be outpacing the resource availability, and in addition to the fact that certain water projects threaten our valuable aquifers and our ability to store water, what policies and infrastructure are you prepared to present or support in order to ensure consistent and equitable allocation of safe drinking water?
So I think part of it is going to be make sure that there is active communication between the state and the federal government and local authorities and county authorities. So part of the reason I think that we are having some issues is we have a representative right now who are not actively lobbying for us to gain the financial resources we need. And frankly, the state's going to have the best opportunity to deploy those resources locally. That being said, I think one of the things that we need to do is we need to stop efforts that go through conservation and then relieve ourselves from conservation cycles. The fact is we know that demand for water is going to fluctuate. We know that the drought situation is going to fluctuate, and we need to have a little bit more of a consistent approach when it comes to conservation to ensure that we're all responsibly working on drinking water.
Mr. Rouda, as part of the negotiations where President Obama bailed out the American automakers, the industry had agreed to raise the fuel efficiency of their cars, known as corporate average fuel economy or CAFE standards. Automakers have reached their first commitment of 34.5 miles per gallon fleet average, and they had agreed to raise the fleet average to 54.5 by 2025. However, ever since Trump got into office, automakers have been asking for permission, and it sounds like today they're officially granting it, for them to ease up on this agreement in order for them to make more gas-guzzling SUVs, since those are more attractive at the moment. Now, at the moment, Congresswoman Doris Matsui has authored a bill to codify the original agreement under Obama into law. Do you support this bill, and do you think it is the legislature's job, for Congress's job, to regulate this as opposed to an executive agency?
Well, I haven't read the bill because there's 7,000 bills submitted to Congress each year, but I do appreciate the concept and would support the concept, but I'd like the luxury of reading the bill. And yes, I absolutely believe Congress' job is to help set those standards. And what I was talking about earlier with what's going on with Trump in California is to this point exactly, where California has set higher fuel standards than the rest of the country, and Trump is trying to roll them back with his administration. I believe that's a mistake. And we've talked about up here on the stage, the best way to move the country forward towards reducing CO2 and improving our air is with the automobile industry. And by moving to electric cars is the fastest way to get there. So we need to be providing economic incentives to build more electric cars, the incentives to individuals to buy them, and that alone will help address moving that fuel standard up.
When do you know it's the decision that it's best left to an agency versus the legislature? Obviously, an agency has the ability to be a little bit more flexible, and a legislature, once it codifies something into law, it's very difficult to reverse that if something goes awry. When do we make that decision? At what point does a Congress member say, it's not up to me?
Well, why is it tough to reverse it? Because if you're suggesting that if we move fuel standards to here, and something happens such as the Third World War that we want to move those standards down, I'm pretty sure we can get Congress together and pass that. So I'm not worried at all about this being a federal mandate to make sure that we have clean energy across the United States and addressing climate change. I think it has to be done. I mean, let's be realistic here. We have a president who has abdicated his obligations on behalf of the country and the world, and we need a president who's willing to step back in.
Dr. Keirstead, the European Union exercises the precautionary principle in chemical policy, where manufacturers must first demonstrate that a chemical or product is safe before it's allowed to go into the marketplace. Should the U.S. exercise the precautionary principle here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've run studies, clinical studies, testing biologics in humans, and looked at regulatory bodies throughout the United States, throughout Europe, throughout Japan, China, and Bahamas and Panama. And all of our regulatory bodies differ a great deal. And Europe has generally had a safety measure that has been the admiration of the world. The FDA used to be, but it is no longer. They are falling behind because they've been underfunded, and in fact, the funding has been further cut by the administration. Well, actually not cut, but just not increased according to standard increases of all the departments. And all of the fees have been rejiggered so that they suppress the development of new technologies. Larger companies have better breaks at the FDA than smaller companies. If we continue on in this vein, all of the innovators go to Europe because we have to have a more efficient system for approving drugs, chemicals, and the like. And their standards are a much, much higher standard that we need to adopt in the United States.
Mr. Siddiqui, the Congressional Review Act, enacted under then-Speaker Newt Gingrich, allows Congress a short window of time after a regulation has been passed by an executive agency to reverse course and revoke that new regulation. Last year, Congress used it to reverse a number of strong environmental policies, including regulations to protect streams, lakes, and rivers. Even though regulations like these can take years of community and scientific input to design, Congress and the President can quickly reverse course without hearings or investing the time needed to understand this regulation. Do you support the continued use of CRAs, and should the law be nullified?
Well, I think that's a very challenging question that has a lot of shades of gray in it. Here's why. Because from administration to administration, things change, priorities change. As you can imagine, during times of war, unfortunately, as you all know, I work with the FBI on national security matters as an advisor. During times of war, our Constitution takes a back seat sometimes. Very unfortunate, but it happens. Similarly, here, we have a situation where I would like to ensure that bills and laws like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, cannot be changed by a rogue Trump administration. However, I think it goes twofold, because once we get a Democrat elected to the White House, once we get a Congress that's blue, I would want to use those laws and reverse all of the pro-coal, anti-environment, EPA laws that are out there. I think that's going to be critical for us too. So I can't say yes or no, because right now I have a great disdain for what the administration is doing to undo a lot of great environmental policy. But on the flip, once we gain control of the government, Congress and the White House, I want to make sure we have that same power to flip things back. The problem with it, as you all know, environmental issues do not change overnight. The environment is a very sensitive system that takes generations and generations to change.
Does anyone else on the panel have a firm feeling on this one, or have any disagreement with Mr. Siddiqui?
I'll add that it is an element of the check and balance system of our government, and it's a very important element of the check and balance system of our government. Right now, we don't have a check and balance. You know, I think it was McMaster that was probably the last very lame check and balance on our president. We've lost that as well. But having, again, a red House and a red Senate and I don't know what the White House is right now, we've lost all hope of check and balance. Fundamentally, we need to put that back into place.
I think it's important to recognize the EPA was passed by Congress and signed by the President of the United States, President Nixon. So the EPA has clear authority and obligations to maintain the environment and protect U.S. citizens. Where it runs a bit amok as an administrative agency is how that is interpreted by the current administration. And we are in strange times. Nowhere since President Nixon have we had such digression from a current administration from any other administration. That has to be reversed.
I would just add one quick question, because very well said, gentlemen. Get pissed off and go vote. Let's do that.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Rouda, during the previous immigration and foreign policy debate, no one cited climate change as a threat to our national security. However, just this past January, a bipartisan coalition of over 100 Congress members urged the White House to reconsider the omission of climate change as a national security threat in its 2018 National Defense Authorization Act. Do you agree with these members that climate change is a serious national security threat? And if so, how would you address this issue in the lens of national security?
Yeah, just to set the record straight, the question asked was what was the number one national security threat to us, and I answered Donald Trump. But I recognize that climate change is a huge national security threat as recognized by the U.S. military. And the reason it's such a huge global threat is that it is estimated because of climate change by 2050, there will be 200 million climate refugees. Let that sink in, 200 million climate refugees, both here in the United States and across the world. So when you have to deal with that type of change on levels not seen since World War II and surpassing in some ways what happened in World War II, it is a threat of national security. And as such, climate change has to be at the top of the list of what needs to be addressed. We've said it repeatedly up here, and we'll say it again. It has to be addressed because it's a national threat, and it is a safety threat, it is a health and lifestyle threat.
Mike, can I add one thing on that?
Sure, quick 30 seconds.
Thanks. Another dimension of that, there will be climate refugees, but we saw the Trump administration authorize how many billions of dollars for troop readiness? climate change, and I think General Mattis is actually the last person in the Trump cabinet that believes in climate change. But he has indicated that climate change is actually one of the greatest threats to troop readiness in the long term. We have bases along waterfronts all over the world, and we see what happens along the waterfronts here at certain points in the year. They flood. And they're having fundamental infrastructure questions that they need to solve to ensure that our bases are actually defended and that our men and women in uniform can be sure to have a place where they can be safe overseas. That is a foreign threat. Thank you.
Mike, may I get 10 seconds on this?
10 seconds, sure.
Thank you, thank you. While national security is a key part of my career and what I do, I will be meeting with FBI Director Wray in about 2 weeks. And one thing I intend to emphasize to him is that climate change is a clear and present danger to our nation. Just look at Puerto Rico and how they're still suffering.
This is the final questions for Dr. Keirstead. The Orange County Register published an article on July 12, 2017 on chronic flooding of coastal Orange County from rising sea levels as a result of climate change. Chronic flooding events will begin to occur by 2030 and greatly affect large areas of Seal Beach, Sunset Beach, Bolsa Chica, Huntington Beach, Newport Beach, and Laguna Beach. What kinds of projects will you promote and advocate for funding to protect our homes and businesses, particularly when faced with local and federal elected officials who don't, quote unquote, believe that there's a problem?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in the last 100 years, our temperature has risen by 1 degree. And all of the scientists in this nation and worldwide feel that when it hits about 1.5, we're in very, very serious trouble because we get a catastrophic increase in the degradation of our poles and water levels rise. We need, first and foremost, to be funding agencies like ARPA-E that are being denigrated by the Trump administration. Okay, the short answer. ARPA-E is the group that actually funds all of the researchers in order to come up with the guidelines that we can follow. They're the ones who said 30% by, 50% by, 1 degree by, now 2 degrees by. We need that information in order to attend to it. Besides that, of course, we need to protect our coasts and all of the agencies that I listed in my previous answer. There's 7 of them. We need to back each one of those and stop the loophole denigration of each one of them.
Great. Now we go on to the next phase of our final phase of this debate. Each of the candidates will be allowed 30 seconds to ask another candidate a question. If you've declined to ask a question, we will ask another question to you instead. We are going to go in order of the vote scores.
It's like a penalty.
It's to see how prepared you are. Mr. Rouda, actually, you're first.
I don't have a question.
Okay, great. Well, then our question to you is, Orange County is within the ancestral homelands of the Tongva and the Achuman people who have witnessed the destruction of countless sacred places over the decades. If elected, how will you work with these California Native American tribes to protect Orange County's remaining open spaces and sites of cultural, environmental, and historical significance?
I'm proud of the fact that we have already received support from some of the Indian tribes, and I recognize that as the original Native Americans that we have a long way to go in addressing the ills that have been put upon them since we discovered America back in the day. We have to work with these tribes to make sure that their ancestral homelands and the reservations are properly taken care of, and I'm committed to doing that and working with them. But I also think that it's the right way to approach that is to work with them to understand from their standpoint where they need help, and then fight like hell in Congress to do just that.
Great. Dr. Keirstead?
Okay, I'll ask you a question, Harley. Since we pulled out of the climate agreement, the Paris Accord, we've left China to be in the lead, actually, and they have probably the worst environmental sins on the planet. You're a director on a board of directors of a company that has operations in China. Do you know about their carbon neutrality or anything like that?
No, I do not.
Okay.
Great. Mr. Siddiqui.
I do not have any questions.
Okay. Then our question
I'm about
to you.
to get one, right?
You're about to get one. Oh, we're prepared. What are tangible steps we can take to bring climate deniers to understand that climate change is a threat to national security? And how do we get them to agree to allocate funds to address climate change with the same intensity as terrorism?
Thank you. Thank you. Love the question.
We try.
You did good. Bottom line, we need to get leadership that recognizes that science is real. How many of you know that Dana Rohrabacher thinks that greenhouse gases are the result of dinosaur flatulence? Like, ridiculous, right?
Wait, it's not true?
Michael, right? Seriously? Michael and Dave. Climate change, like I said, is a clear and present danger to our national security. The Pentagon even considers it one of the greatest threats in our 21st century. When you consider global temperatures, changing global temperatures, rising sea levels, warming oceans, shrinking ice sheets, glacial retreats, ocean acidification, decreased snow cover, and extreme weather events, that's undeniable. Think just about Puerto Rico and New Orleans and how impacted those cities have been. We need to make sure that we recognize from top to bottom that environmental crisis, environmental security is national security.
And lastly, Mr. Kotick.
I'm not letting you ask me a question. I'm going to ask one. Okay, Harley, this is
Yes.
for you, my man. So I think we can all agree, and I said this from the very beginning of this campaign, that we cannot dust off the old Democratic Party playbook to win this seat. We have to think differently and fundamentally different. If we look back at the 2016 election, we saw that that approach of how that election took place, which included party infighting and negative ads, caused a critical number of people to stay home. Specifically, 4% of people who voted for Barack Obama, mainly people of color and young people, stayed home and did not vote in the 2016 election. The question to you, Harley, is, do you plan on using negative attack ads? And if so, how do you ensure that these two critical groups that are fundamentally imperative to flipping this district remain inspired to turn out for elections in 2018?
I do not intend on using negative attack ads, but I will defend myself. And as far as getting the millennials out, you hit a really important point here. And I think the most relevant factor that we have seen in recent time was the 2017 election in Virginia. And in Virginia, we saw the millennials helping carry the day. To be specific, I think the numbers were somewhere around in 2015 when they turned out, it was about 25% of millennials, and it grew to, I believe, over 40% in the 2017 election. And in that 2017 election, 2/3 of the voters, those millennial voters, voted Democrat. 2 years before, it was about a 50-50 split. So it is imperative that we get millennials out, and I'm thrilled to see a bunch of millennials in the room here. In fact, I'm a father of 4 millennials, and we need to get them out. It is a key part of the vote, but it's also important that everybody get out, because guess what? If we vote, we win.
That's right. And now each of the candidates will get 90 seconds for your closing statements, and we once again go through the order of the vote scores. So, Mr. Rouda, you were first.
Aaron, is it reversed this time?
Oh, look, great. Fantastic. Then
Fine-
it is
fi-
reversed.
fine
in
print.
reverse order of the scores.
Nice. Great. So I have 90 seconds. First, I want to thank you all for coming to these. I think that I was talking to someone just a little bit earlier, and we have had a number of different candidate forums, and it really is good to see everybody. I think we've all gotten to know each other quite a bit over the course of the last year. Specifically in regards to the environment to me, especially to the generation that I believe I represent, is facing what I consider to be the 3 Ds that is fundamentally unraveling all of the progress that we have made: denial, defunding, and delaying progress. This cannot happen, mainly because it is being used as a tool, as a hostage to pay back reckless financial irresponsibility on behalf of the current administration. We need to do a whole lot. The environment is one piece to that puzzle, but it is something that will unlock future growth for generations to come, as well as to help to challenge ourselves to become better leaders in the global economy that we frankly are missing at this point in time. So I'm committed to the environment. I'm excited to be here with all of you. I'm excited to be with these great candidates, and I thank you all for coming out tonight.
Mr. Siddiqui?
Thank you. Well, as an environmental engineer and environmental lawyer and your future congressman, I will advocate for a green future, a green environment, and a green economy. We can do better. I will have the honor on April 30th to be one of the very few candidates in history to get sworn in to the United States Supreme Court. I get to do that on April 30th. But the reason I say that with you is not only will I be able to fight for you in Congress, but if I don't like the way they're acting, I'll file a lawsuit and get it all the way to the Supreme Court and argue it there too. We have to stop living on this planet as if we have another one to go to, because that isn't an option either, because Trump has defunded NASA as well. The threat of climate change affects our geopolitical order, it affects our world map, it affects who we are as a nation. Climate change is a threat to our planet. It's a threat to our national security. And in this dangerous, changing world, you need a congressman who's a national security expert, not like Dana Rohrabacher, who's a national security threat. You need a congressman who understands issues, who's an engineer, who's a lawyer, who understands what it means to fight in the trenches. You need someone who's at the forefront of legal regulation and engineering technology and is ready for the job on day one. I am that candidate. I need your vote. I need your support. June 5th, omarinthehouse.com. Thank you.
Dr. Keirstead.
Well, I think it's clear to say that we are in the worst of political times. We've got more greed and corruption. We have self-interest and self-preservation and special interest. And nowhere is it hitting more than in the two fields of healthcare and the environment. The environment is being denigrated by all of those ills that I just mentioned. And it is far past time that we put facts and science and issues in our decision-making rather than partisan politics. So my name is Dr. Hans Keirstead. I am a scientist. I'm the only person running in this race that has actually worked on the Hill, in the House and in the Senate, writing laws with congressmen. I've done this in 4 other nations. I'm a scientist that knows how to protect your special interests, which are, environment being a social injustice, and that we need someone to stand up to that and the denigration of the society in those poor areas where it hits it worst. Someone that's at the table to look for the soother in your child's mouth at the denigrations there, to the air, to the water. So I'm asking for your support. I will be there both as a scientist, also as a congressman, but also as a lover of our environment. Thank you.
Of course, Mr. Rouda.
Well, it's been over a year since we started this campaign, and we have come a long way. But the one thing that is certain, when I meet with you, when I meet with the communities, even across the state and across our country, what we have in common is far greater than what separates us. Basically, all of us care about taking care of our kids, taking care of our families, taking care of our schools, and taking care of our communities. And what we've got going on right now with the Trump administration and Rohrabacher is actions that are completely against those 4 things. I'm prepared to go to Washington and fight for what's important. And I'm prepared to take on Dana Rohrabacher. Dana Rohrabacher, I'm not scared of him. I can't wait to take him on in the general. And guess what? You need somebody who is willing to take on the fight that needs to be taken on. And I used to box. I can take a punch, and I can throw a punch, and I'm ready to knock Rohrabacher out in November with your help. Thank you.
Can we give them a standing ovation, everyone? Can we give them a standing ovation? Thank you guys so much for coming out today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you guys for coming out. Before you leave, please fill out. We need you guys to fill out the straw poll. That's very important. Fill out the straw poll so we can know how they did tonight. We'll be publishing that shortly after. What's also super important is if you guys make sure it doesn't end here. You need to make sure to talk to your friends, make sure they get out to vote, whether that's door knocking or whatever. Thank you for all of your time. Have a great night. I'll see you later. And big thank you to Mike Young and our fact checkers. And big thank you to the ladies from Wave who did the timekeeping. Say thank you to them as well. Thank you. Have a good day.